Hey, it's Trail from over to GOHUNT, and we're going to do a little series on elk habitat. We're going to run through the best species there is to hunt, which is elk. Sorry, Brady, I know that you're doing one on mule deer. This one will be way more popular because people love to hunt elk. Elk are the best species. So as part of that series, we wanted to kind of break it down and give people, whether they're a seasoned hunter or whether they're a beginner, just some ideas on where to start. And I think one of the best places to start in terms of elk is getting to know elk behavior, elk habitat. And today I wanted to dive in and talk about habitat and habitat needs. So typically you hear elk. What does an elk need? An elk needs water, needs cover, needs food. I would actually kind of almost rank them in that order. Water is a vital factor for elk, much more so than mule deer or other species that you might want to hunt. Elk absolutely have to water. They're a big animal. As you look through the studies and you kind of get to know elk a little bit better, elk need to drink almost every single day, typically from the spring months all the way through the summer and then the fall. Once snow starts to fly, elk will eat snow, so they're definitely not as dependent on water during those late seasons if you're hunting in a state that gets pretty ample snow. So it's not necessarily an issue there, but they absolutely have to water. And from those prime season dates, whether it's early, kind of mid-August until October, you really should be looking at water and how it relates to elk. An adult elk could drink up to 4 gallons of water a day, which is a lot of water. When you get into the arid Southwest, you get to a state like Arizona, New Mexico, it's hot, maybe some of the Southwest desert country in Nevada or Utah. You know, elk have got to water. They've got to water every single day, and they may actually water twice a day depending on what the temperature is and, you know, the expenditure of energy. So I wanted to talk maybe some specifics about elk and water and how those two relate, and maybe you can potentially use those to help you fill your tag each year. One thing that I would touch on first is the timing that elk typically water. So elk are typically what they call crepuscular, which is a kind of a scientific term. I'm pulling that one back up from my biology days, but they're most active in the early morning, kind of those first daylight hours, and then those evening hours. And I would suggest to you, in my experience, that's most often when elk are going to visit a water source. It's not always the case. Elk can water any time of the day. But primarily, if you're looking for elk traveling from water to a bedding area or from a bedding area to water, for the most part, it's going to be those early morning hours, just after sunrise, maybe till 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning, and then afternoon hours, mid-afternoon until evening darkness. So those are kind of the prime times that elk typically water. I would say that that's probably a bigger factor for states, more mountainous states. You're talking your northern states where you've typically got more cover, you've got more shade, those kinds of factors. When you get into those arid, hot Southwest areas, Arizona, elk could typically water any time of the day, and they often do so in the middle of the day just because the temperatures are so high, it's so hot. Elk needs to get up and get some water. So that's one thing I would think about, is the timing that an elk waters typically. The next thing I would talk about would be standing water versus running water, like a stream or a creek. Certainly elk will water at a river, they'll water at a stream or a creek that's running pretty rapid. In my experience though, elk actually seem to prefer standing water. And there's a couple of reasons why I think that's the case. One of them being predation. If you think about running water, the noise that's caused by running water, that's a major, detriment to one of their primary senses of defense, which is their ears. They can't necessarily hear as well. There's also some speculation, if you will, that elk prefer to water in standing water because the macronutrients in that water is a little bit better, so it's maybe got a little bit nutritional benefit to them, although I don't know that it's significant. But typically I would say elk prefer to water at standing water. So you're talking, cattle troughs, ponds, holding tanks, those kinds of things. And then as you move into those mountainous areas, that when you think about traditional elk habitat, you're talking the heads of creeks, springs, seeps that are coming out of the side of a hillside. Anywhere where you've got a little bit of a pocket of water that's standing water, it seems to be, in my experience, a more preferred location for elk to water and to visit. So that's one thing I would touch on. The next being wallows. So an elk will typically, a bull elk, will wallow, and they do that primarily from maybe late August until October, like early October. And if you think about what is an elk wallow, essentially what it is a big mud hole, a pit, a chunk of water where an elk can get out there and he can coat himself in mud and water. Typically they'll urinate in it and they'll kick all that mud up on them. And essentially what they're creating is a walking billboard for themselves. So those bulls are going to stink themselves up, and as they walk through the woods, that scent that they've put on themselves is going to advertise to the cows, hey, I'm available, I'm a bull, I'm ready to rut, come check me out. And wallows can be a really good spot to ambush a bull, especially between that time frame, between late August and the end of September. I've shot a lot of bulls off of water, off of wallows. And I would tell you again, you're looking for those similar types of areas. You're looking for standing water, whether that's a holding tank in a state like New Mexico in a dry area, or potentially the head of a creek or a spring or a seep that's got some standing water. And I would say that's a great spot. You definitely want to check those out. It's one of the very first things I do when it comes to scouting, and even more specifically through e-scouting. E-scouting, you could really use your GOHUNT maps, and I do this all the time. You pull up the aerial imagery, you scan the landscape, and really what you're looking for are those lush pockets. It's going to indicate that there's some water in it, so that you've got maybe a flat or a bench that's on the edge of some timber, and you're really looking for those dished out depressions, and you can see them if you're looking at aerial imagery on GOHUNT maps. And you can really start to pick apart and find those wallows via aerial imagery. It's like I said, it's one of the very first things I start to look for when I'm e-scouting an area. I'm going to go ahead and drop pins on every one of those that I think is interesting. I'm looking for those dished out depressions in a really nice green, lush area in that vegetation, so that I know that there's got to be some water there. And when you see that telltale sign of that nice dished out wallow, it's a spot I would definitely drop a pin in, and it's worth checking out when you get out on your hunt. I highly suggest finding wallows. If you can find a wallow on a bench that's in close proximity to some dark timber or even in some dark timber, it's a mecca for bull elk, especially during the rut. The next thing I wanted to cover is elk cover or bedding areas. And I want to talk about that because I think it's probably one of the most useful options for you to scout, to look for, to consider when you're e-scouting an area or when you get out on the landscape and you're looking for options of where you think elk might be. Typically, elk are looking for two things when they look for a bedding area. So you're looking primarily for comfort and security. Security, they absolutely have to remain away from predators. They have to be able to use their faculties to keep predators away. So an elk's primary defense mechanisms are going to be their nose, their ears, and their eyesight. So they're looking for areas where they can utilize those defense mechanisms to remain safe, if you will. Secondarily, I would say comfort, but it definitely is a factor for elk when they're looking at a bedding area. I think elk are looking for comfort and primarily looking for shady areas. So like I said, elk are a big animal. It's a high energy expenditure for those just to maintain body temperature and regulation. So looking for shady areas. And when I talk about shady areas, I'm talking mature timber, dark timber. And elk prefer that because, like I said, it provides them security. It provides them the ability to shade themselves, to help them with their body temperature regulation. And then also it helps from wind protection and wind chill. And that may become more important as you get later into that season, but certainly that is a consideration for elk. I'm going to run through some statistics for you that can help you in your e-scouting. I mentioned dark timber for the purpose of shade, protection from precipitation, also from reduced wind speeds. I looked through some literature. Typically 50 to 70% reduction in wind speed as you get into large old growth dark timber. So that's definitely worth consideration. Next, preferred bedding cover, typically 75 to 100% closed canopy. So as you're looking at an aerial image of an area and you're kind of considering it for a bedding area, typically elk prefer that really enclosed canopy. So you're talking 75 to 100% closed canopy. They're looking for an area that's large enough that can provide them security from being seen, and then also, like I said, from wind chill, wind protection. So typically elk prefer something in that 70 to 60 acre size and much larger, so bigger than 60 acres, but I would say typically it's got to be about 30, 60 acres to be considered a good elk bedding area. Early season, so early season, summer, like I said, through that October time frame, elk are looking for shady, cool areas to bed. The soil temperature is cooler, there's better feed in those areas, and it's also going to provide them shade. When I'm looking at a landscape to consider it for bedding area, I'm looking for northeast facing slopes during that early season. I'm primarily a bow hunter, so those are the areas that I'm really looking for. And to do that, I'm using my GOHUNT maps, and I'm using our tools that we have available to us within that GOHUNT maps. The terrain analysis tool, I can highlight just northeast facing slopes. I can also look at flats and benches. And I just go through and I toggle those on, and very easily I can cruise across the landscape and I can identify areas that are northeast facing slopes, and then I can start to evaluate the size of a timber patch to see if it matches what I'm looking for, ideally for elk habitat. I'm also can look at the canopy. Does it have enough canopy to really offer the shade that an elk will be looking for? So between those tools, the terrain analysis tool, and then the other statistics that I kind of just mentioned to you, the measuring tool on GOHUNT maps, I can really start to evaluate a landscape and look for areas that are probably the most suitable for elk and bedding areas. If I find a water source within those, a seep or a creek or stream that's got kind of a little head of a stream, I know that I'm going to find elk. So definitely worth considering. Late season is a little bit different. If you've got a late season rifle tag, elk will move out onto south slopes because that's primarily where that late season feed is. The sunshine's going to hit those south facing slopes. They're going to warm up and that vegetation is going to pop, and so those elk are going to pop out on that to feed. If it's really cold, they're still probably going to timber up again to remain out of that wind and to alleviate that negative impact of wind chill. So you're probably still looking for some bedding areas, but it's definitely not uncommon later in the season to see elk bedded on a south facing slope just to get some sunshine, get some warmth. And again, it's all about body temperature regulation when it comes to elk, because they're a big animal. It's a big energy cost for them to regulate their own body temperature. So that's kind of late season look and a look at that. Here's a little statistic for you. South facing slopes are used in the winter twice as much as they are during the summer. So if you got that late season tag, maybe you drew a November rifle tag in Utah, or you've got an over-the-counter tag in Colorado, and you got some snow on the ground, a south facing slope is a great place to start looking and really starting to pick apart the landscape and look for elk use in that area. A couple other factors I would talk about as it relates to bedding areas. Elk prefer benches, they prefer gradual slopes, they prefer ridge lines. I looked at some statistics. Elk use increases with slope up to about 30 or 40%, which is pretty damn steep. So up until that point, it increases. You get above and beyond 40%. Typically, elk do not prefer that. It's just too steep. Elk prefer slopes in that 15 to 30% range. And like I said, a bench, a saddle, any kind of area that's a little bit of a flat spot and a shady dark timber patch is a preferred location for elk. You can think about it, if an elk's bedded on a really steep slope, even if he's in a dark timber patch, essentially he would have to get up and move his body in different directions to then evaluate the landscape, whether it's the wind coming up the slope or, his eyesight. Whereas if you have a nice gradual spot, an elk has the ability to move his head around. He can definitely observe his landscape a lot easier. The herd can better evaluate the landscape. Elk are a herd animal. Every elk in that herd is kind of involved in protection of the herd. They're looking out for themselves as well as the herd, and they can really spread out on a nice flat spot and evaluate the landscape for danger. The thermals are typically, good in those areas. So I would say look for those benches, look for those slopes. Again, you can use your GOHUNT maps. Specifically at this point, I like to use the topographic maps. As you're evaluating a landscape, you can look for where the contour lines are more spread out. So the steeper the contour lines, the closer those are together, the steeper the slope. So when I'm looking at a map and trying to evaluate it for a bedding area, it's really handy to look at topo, look for where those lines start to spread out, which would indicate somewhat of a flat or a bench. And then you can toggle back and forth between the topographic map, aerial imagery, and you can really start to evaluate if it's got every other feature that an elk prefers for a bedding area. And it's a really handy tool. It's one that I use all the time. I toggle back and forth between topographic and aerial imagery to evaluate the landscape. Lastly, in terms of bedding areas and feeding areas, and this has kind of jumped me into that portion of this, elk are an animal that loves edge habitat, just like mule deer. They like those mosaics, whether it's a burn and a bedding area or meadows and dark timber for bedding areas. They like that edge habitat. It allows them to quickly get into cover, also allows them to feed, and it's close proximity to each other. So when I'm looking at a landscape and I'm evaluating it for bedding areas, I'm also looking for feeding areas, a lot of edge habitat, a nice mosaic. And I lump that in with every other thing that I've talked about right now. You can really start to pick apart a landscape and identify very specifically areas that are more likely to occur in. All right, and lastly, I wanted to talk about elk feed and what they're like as a feeding animal. Studies suggest that ideal elk habitat consists of about 40% cover, so bedding areas, and 60% foraging areas. So they definitely have to have those large areas for bigger herds of elk to feed. And you're looking for both of those in relation to each other. Elk are selective feeders more so than cattle, but they're not as selective as a mule deer. They're more of a generalist. Elk will eat forbs, they'll eat grasses, they'll eat browse, they'll eat shrubs and trees and willows as they get further into the season. But elk can live in a lot of different habitats, and they have a much more diverse diet in comparison to a mule deer. If you bump a herd of elk out of a drainage, elk have no issue moving into the next drainage or the drainage beyond that to find feed because they're a big animal and they can eat a lot of different plants and meet their nutritional needs. Elk eat between 1.7 and 2.9 pounds of dry meadow grass per 100 pounds, which means that a big bull elk, he could eat between 12 and 18 pounds of forage a day. So an elk needs to be feeding, it needs a lot of good forage. A summer elk diet is primarily composed of 30% grasses and maybe 60 to 70% forbs. So that time frame when a cow is nursing a calf, she wants the highest value of protein and nutrition that she can find, which is typically in a forb. It's going to provide better feed for her. Same with the bull elk. He's growing antlers. He's got to have really good feed. He's also got to put body weight on for the rut. As those elk move into late summer and fall months, their diet kind of transitions away from so much forbs into more grasses. So those forbs typically cure out. A lot of your grasses are starting to cure out, but it's a better feed source for them later in the summer and then also through the fall months. So primarily during the fall, elk are eating grasses. Some of the preferred grasses, as you look across the landscape, this isn't the case because elk occur across a wide variety of states and habitats. But just to suggest a few, blue bunch wheatgrass, western wheatgrass, Idaho fescue, Sandberg's bluegrass, grasses. Those are a really key component for those elk during the time frame when you're going to be out hunting them. If you get into an area and it's been absolutely nuked by cattle, they're out on that open range and landscape, it's probably not a great spot for elk because there really isn't the feed component they need. So that's something worth considering as you're looking at a landscape. When I'm doing my e-scouting, again, I'm looking at a landscape, I'm looking for green areas, pockets, I'm looking for areas that look lush, that look like they have good feed. And like I said, those are in relation into good bedding areas. You definitely have to consider feed because like I said, elk are a big animal. They need 12 to 18 pounds potentially of feed per day. Another couple things I would talk about in regards to elk and feed is that elk prefer open areas typically to feed. I've been on hunts in New Mexico where we were hunting bulls in the timber as they were kind of moving in the morning back to their bedding areas. And you could tell where at night they'd spent those times out in those big open meadows. So elk like open space to feed, they prefer it. It's not to say that they won't feed in timber areas if there is enough feed, but they like those open areas. When I look at a map or a landscape when I'm e-scouting, I'm looking for open meadows. And another couple things that I always consider are clear cuts and fire, so burn scars. Burn scars produce feed initially within that first year, and 2 years they really get going, and they're really productive all the way up to maybe 10 years. Certainly they're less so beyond that, but a burn area is always worth considering when you're scouting for elk, and then specifically when you get out and you're hunting, I would always check burn scars. And if you've got a nice mosaic of dark timber and burned areas or clear cuts, those are definitely worth your consideration. Our maps, we specifically break out the fires by year, and you can turn on those layers by year. And I think that's really important because you want to find the areas that are most recently burned, because those are going to be the more productive for feed. So when I'm doing my e-scouting, I'm going to turn on the last 5-6 years worth of burns in the area that I'm scouting. Those are areas I'm going to start, and I'm going to put the whole puzzle together, considering bedding areas, feeding areas, and burn scars. And then really I can start to paint a great picture for me and put myself in a good area to scout. The last thing I would touch on is don't overlook beetle killed areas. There's large portions of the western states that have had beetle kill, and I think people check them off their list as not available or open to elk. And in reality, a lot of those elk remain in those beetle killed areas because the canopy's been opened up. It allows sunlight, so you've got good feed. You've also increased the water because you've eliminated those live trees, so now there's more ground or surface water. And so don't overlook a beetle-killed area. I've hunted a lot of areas where those elk never come out of there because it's got a lot of feed, it's got the cover that they need, and it typically also has new water sources that are starting to pop up because there's more resources available. It just pops. So don't overlook a beetle-killed area. Don't overlook a fire, especially within that first 5-year window of a burn. And really, you got to consider feed. And that kind of wraps up what I would touch on for this first part of this series. You got to consider all three of those. Water, I definitely start with water for elk because they're dependent on it. Cover, elk need cover. Bedding area is a great spot to focus on. Really start to put together the picture for where elk are going to end up mid-afternoon when they bed. And then finally, feed. You definitely have to have feed. Elk or a big animal, they gotta have feed. So use those tips and tricks, use those on your GOHUNT maps, use the layers available to you, the terrain analysis tool, the slope, the aspect. If you use all these and you do it right, you spend some time before you ever even leave your house, you should have a really good plan in place on where elk are going to be on the landscape before you even get to your hunt area. So check those out. Those are my tips and tricks for elk. We're going to do a series. We're going to touch more on elk behavior that'll help you guys out. If you got comments, drop them below. If you have observations when you're out in the field and you think they might be helpful to other people, drop those in the comments below. Like I said, if you're not a member, get yourself a GOHUNT Insider account or an Explorer account. Those are great options for you to help you do the research you need to find success this fall.